We're dealing a lot today, this morning, with the topic of sin. And if I were to list some on the screen, obviously we look at things like murder, rape, drug abuse, child trafficking, all of these different big sins, and we think to ourselves, I do not want my children getting involved in any of that. And as a result, most parents, we work really, really hard to make sure that our kids don't commit those sins. And hopefully, we're also bringing them to Bible class, to worship, to make sure that they learn to love Jesus and they learn His Word. We work hard to monitor maybe what goes into their minds, protect their hearts. But there is one sin that is often overlooked. And it's a sin that sometimes children develop very young. Parents don't say anything about it. And oftentimes the reason the parents don't say anything about it is because the parents are wrestling with it themselves. And that sin is pride. It is one of those things that when you stop and think about it, probably more members of the church wrestle with this than just about anything. The Bible speaks very plainly about it. Proverbs chapter 16, verse 5. Everyone proud in heart is an abomination to the Lord. Though they join forces, none will go unpunished. Or how about Proverbs chapter 6? Starting in verse 16, he says, These 6 things doth the Lord hate, yea, 7 are an abomination unto him. What's the very first one? A proud look. So this morning, what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about this in context of Luke chapter 15, because again, I think this is one of those sins that is likely to keep more people out of heaven than just about anything else. In this room that I'm looking at right now, I strongly suspect there's not been too many murders committed. But I suspect there have been occasions of pride. And this is one of those things that will keep us out of heaven forever. And so we need to at least talk about it. We need to at least look at it. And on top of that, you need to think about what our culture is teaching our young people today. Because I dare say it's actually getting worse. You see the slogans on the screen behind me, where, for instance, folks say, believe in yourself, build yourself up, make yourself a top priority. The only thing that matters in life is your own opinion and yourself. Empower yourself, or to fall in love with yourself is the first secret to happiness. Anybody see a problem with all those slogans that are very, very popular, by the way, today? Who do they leave out? They leave out God. Folks, if it's all about ourselves, then what we just did was we built an idol to ourselves. Here's the problem. Problem number 1. People who need to hear a message about pride, they don't think that it's for them. Oh yeah, this is good for so-and-so to hear. Problem number 2, most people don't think they have a problem with pride. Problem number 3, it's not really viewed as a big sin, so we don't really emphasize it a whole lot at the church. And last but not least, number 4, while it's easy to spot in others, sometimes it's kind of hard to see in ourselves. So let's take a look at Luke chapter 15. And I want you to understand up front that when Jesus was delivering this message, He gave 3 parables that were meant to all go together. Now, I realize sometimes people will take one of these and maybe they'll teach a lesson on it. But in context, and what He's actually doing right here, He is making sure that the Pharisees follow Him through all 3 parables. Now again, to put it in some context, we're going to back up and start looking in Luke chapter 7, verse 36. Luke chapter 7, verse 36. And I want you to listen to what's going on, because it's going to help us to really understand when we get to Luke chapter 15. Verse 36 says, "Then one of the Pharisees asked him to eat with him. And he went to the Pharisee's house, and he sat down to eat." Verse number 1, what do we learn? We learned that Jesus was being invited to go and dine with the Pharisees. Now flip over to Luke chapter 11, verse 37. "And as he spoke, a certain Pharisee asked him to dine with him. So he went in, he sat down to eat." So again, Pharisees welcoming Jesus. "Hey, come eat with me." Chapter 13, verse 10. "Now he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath." So kind of follow what's happening here. Jesus being welcomed by the Pharisees. They want him to eat with him. They're allowing him to teach in the synagogue. Luke chapter 14, verse 1. "Now it happened as he went into the house of one of the rulers of the Pharisees to eat bread on the Sabbath, they watched him closely." So Luke here, he's showing us a pattern. Then we get to Luke chapter 14, verse 25. "Now great multitudes went with him, and they turned and said to him, 'If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and his mother, his wife and his children, brothers and sisters, yes, his own wife, he cannot be my disciple.'" Okay, now with those passages in mind, let's turn and let's look at Luke chapter 15, starting in verse 1. "And all the tax collectors and the sinners drew near to him. The Pharisees and the scribes complained, saying, 'This man receives sinners and eats with them.' So he spoke this parable to them, saying," all right, make sure you don't miss this first part. Because realistically, what I've highlighted and underlined right here, this is the problem. Don't forget, previously, Pharisees were saying, "Hey, come eat with me. Come teach in the synagogue." And now all of a sudden, the Pharisees and the scribes are complaining because who's around him. With that in mind, take a look with me starting in verse 4. This is the first of 3 parables. Again, let me point out to you, I think when Jesus gave these, he meant for them to be given together. "What man of you, having 100 sheep, if he loses one of them, does not leave the 99 in the wilderness, go after the one which is lost until he finds it? When he has found it, he lays it on his shoulders, rejoicing. When he comes home, he calls together his friends and neighbors, saying to them, 'Rejoice with me, for I found my sheep, which was lost.' I say to you likewise, there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 persons who need no repentance." So follow me for just a minute and think about what Jesus is doing. Multitudes of people are now following after him. The Pharisees see it, they don't like it. He says, "All right, guys, let me tell you a little story. This guy that got 100 sheep." Now, the Pharisees knew about sheep, okay? This is a culture where they would have definitely understood sheep. He says, "Guy's got 100 sheep. He loses one. What's he do? He goes, he finds it. And when he finds that 1%, what's he do? He calls his friends. They rejoice together." Now, you can just imagine the Pharisees kind of nodding in agreement. Yeah, man, lose a sheep, find it, you rejoice. And in fact, back during those days, had you lost a sheep, and maybe it kind of continued to wander off, you know what you'd do? You'd actually put it on your shoulders, and you might break its legs on purpose. It's called hobbling a sheep. If you do that and you carry it around on your shoulders for several days, once the legs heal, guess what? That sheep will never leave your side. We don't know why, But we know shepherds use that quite often if a sheep starts to kind of wander away. So here he is, he's talking to these Pharisees. Let me tell you this story. Guy loses 1% of his sheep, finds it. What do? We rejoice. All right. Next story. Or what of a woman having 10 silver coins, she loses 1 coin, does not light a lamp, sweep the house, search carefully until she finds it. When she's found it, she calls her friends and neighbors together, saying, "Rejoice with me, for I found the piece which I lost." Likewise, I say to you, there is joy in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents. So, again, picture what Jesus is doing. Oh, okay, so you think I'm hanging out with the wrong crowd. Let's talk. Let me tell you a little story. Guy's got 100 sheep, loses 1, finds it. What do? They rejoice. Okay. Lady's got 10 coins. Loses 1. That's 10% of her wealth. Now notice again, Jesus is using things that these Pharisees definitely could relate to, right? Think they can relate to sheep? Yep. Think they can relate to money? Yep. Because they were actually taking a cut from the tables that Jesus had flipped in the temple. Person loses 10% of the wealth, finds it. What do? We rejoice. And just to put that in perspective for a second, 10% of your wealth. Imagine if you were supposed to go out, eat with the guys. Maybe ladies have an afternoon lunch with some of your friends, and you realize you've lost over a month's salary. That's a pretty big deal. But what happens when you find it? Oh man, you are, whoo! You call your friends, lunch is on, let's go, I'm buying. You're excited. So here's what he's doing. He is painting a picture using these first 2 parables, something that they can easily relate to. And now look at verse 11. And he said, a certain man had 2 sons. All right, so follow me for just a minute. We're going from 1% of your sheep, 10% of your wealth, to 50% of your sons. He goes on to say this. The younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the portions of good that fall to me." So he divided to them his livelihood. And not many days after, the younger son gathered all together, journeyed to a far country, and there he wasted his possessions with prodigal living. All right, we got to stop there because there's a whole lot to unpack in this passage right here. Younger son says, "I want my inheritance." Folks, when do you get your inheritance? When your parent dies. This is a young son who's saying, "Dad, you're not dying quick enough. I want my money. Give it to me." Not just that, it says he goes away to a far country. Doesn't even tell us where. And doesn't have to, because think about this for just a minute. These are Jews, Israelites in the promised land. If you go down into a foreign country, that means you're in a pagan land. So here's a young man who's basically saying, "Look, I want my inheritance now. I'm going to go away from all these believers to a pagan land," and he's wasting it. Verse 14. But when he had spent all, there arose a severe famine in the land, and he began to be in want. And he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him into the fields to feed swine. And they would gladly have filled his stomach with the pods that the swine ate. No one gave him anything. Again, we start unpacking this, and here's what we see. Jesus is painting this guy as the worst scoundrel you'll ever meet. There's these Jewish Pharisees, and they listen how this guy wants his money before his dad's dead. He goes to a pagan land. He starts wasting it. He spends it all. Now, that's pretty bad. And there's a famine in the land. And these Pharisees recognize that back during those times, anytime a famine was mentioned or referenced, that usually meant a judgment from God. So he's down there in the pagan land. There's a famine going on, and now he has to work with pigs. And again, I don't think I have to tell most of the adults in this room, Jews and pigs, they didn't mix. And yet he's wanting to just eat the leftovers that the pigs don't want. Verse 17. But when he came to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have bread enough and to spare? And I perish with hunger. I will arise and go to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. This is a young man who is basically at the pit of his life. And he realizes it. And he repents and wants to go home. I'm going to say something to the adults in this room that may catch you off guard a little bit. But I want you to think about it over the next week. There may be a time in your child or someone you love's life that you have to pray them to the pit. And what I mean by that is, you may have to pray, Lord, get them to this place right here where they are at the very bottom and they finally wake up and realize it. Verse 20. And he arose and he came to his father, but when he was still a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion, ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I am no longer worthy to be your son. Anybody think that maybe, just maybe, this son was rehearsing what he would say as he was going back home? I would have. I want to get the words right. I want to make sure that it comes across with the right spirit. Verse 22, but the father said to his servants, bring out the best robe, put it on him. Put a ring on his hand, his sandals on his feet. Bring the fatted calf here and kill it. Let us eat and be merry, for this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and he's found. And they began to be merry. So, again, picture what's happening with Jesus and these Pharisees. He's painted this young man as greedy and impatient. He goes to a faraway country. He squanders his money in reckless living. There's a famine in the land. He gets a job feeding pigs. And let me just point out, that'd be a whole lot worse than working at McDonald's. Jesus purposely painting this son worse than the tax collectors and sinners. He is everything that could possibly go wrong, be wrong. But he's 50% of the man's sons. You lose a sheep, you find it, what do? You rejoice. You lose 10% of your wealth, you find it, what do? You rejoice. You lose 50% of your sons. You find it? What do? You rejoice. Now, this is where I'm going to throw you guys a little bit of a hook. Because I suspect most of you in this room, you have heard about the prodigal son. Maybe you even kind of thought of yourself as that prodigal son. Yeah, I was out, man. You don't know how I was lost. I was in that pig pen. And I came back. And we hear sermons about the father waiting on the porch, and he's running. In fact, there have been books written about the father running. And yet, here's what I want to throw you this morning. These three parables put together, when you get to this point, please understand, it is not about the prodigal son. It's about the elder brother. Why do I say that? Far, far too often what we're doing is we're focusing on that prodigal, and we don't realize the real message that Jesus Christ is trying to teach these Pharisees. Notice who Jesus really focuses on. It's not the prodigal. Because unlike the first two, lose a sheep, find it, what do you do? Rejoice. Lose a coin, find it, what do you do? Rejoice. Lose half of your sons, find him, what do you do? Rejoice. But now he's going to keep going in this parable. Verse 15. Now his older brother or older son was in the field. When he came and he drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what these things meant. And he said to him, your brother has come home, and because he's received him safe and sound, your father has killed the fatted calf. But he was angry and would not go in. And therefore his father came out and pleaded with him. And so he answered and said to his father, lo, these many years I have been serving you. I never transgressed your commandment at any time. And yet you never gave me a young goat that I might make merry with my friends. But as soon as this son of yours came, who has devoured your livelihood with harlots, you killed the fatted calf for him. Verse 31. And he said to him, son, you're always with me, and all that I have is yours. It was right that we should make merry and be glad, for your brother was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. All right. Don't forget the first two verses of Luke chapter 15. Now that we've come to the end, think back about what was really happening. Jesus had multitudes of people coming to him. And in those multitudes, there were some folks that were a little sketchy. Sinners, tax collectors. And all of a sudden, these Pharisees cross their arms and they start looking down on, this man eats with the sinners and the tax collectors. He's hanging out with the wrong kind of people. And yet Jesus' point in these three parables is basically to say, oh, you think they're the wrong kind of people? Let me show you who are really the wrong kind of people. Yeah, that younger brother, he was a sinner. He was greedy. He was impatient. He hung out with the pigs. He didn't honor his father. But he repented. In fact, he came home and his heart was changed. The elder brother, on the other hand, he doesn't even realize his heart is ruined. You see, this parable, we a lot of times we call it parable of the prodigal son. We ought to call it the parable of the elder brother. Because when you stop and think about it, here's this older brother who's saying, look, I kept the rules. You owe me. Because I kept the rules and he didn't keep the rules. How dare you celebrate him and not me? Well, that's pride, folks. Because after all, isn't it about the one who keeps all the rules? He thinks he's earned it. And yet, Jesus is trying to point out to the Pharisees, you think these guys right here are the ones that are the wrong people? have you examined your own heart lately? Have you really thought about how you look at people? Now here's a message I want for parents, and please do not miss this one. How many times do we pray that our child will not be that prodigal? You know, we don't want them getting involved in those big sins that I mentioned up front. We don't want them murdering, we don't want them raping, we don't want them doing horrible stuff. But are we praying that they won't have the heart of the elder brother? Because again, the prodigal was saved. In the end of this story, there is a beautiful reunion. And that prodigal actually comes home. It's the elder brother that feels like he's actually earned it. Now, I'm going to pause for just a minute and just talk about something that we need to at least hint on. And that is the idea of works righteousness. Can you earn your salvation? Folks, if you could earn your salvation, you'd be the one on the cross and not Jesus Christ. You didn't do anything. He did it all. And it is because of his love and grace that we actually have hope and have redemption. And so Jesus is trying to tell these folks, hey, you think that they're the ones that are... Have you examined your own heart lately? Again, I'm going to say this, and I hope that maybe you'll kind of think about it. There are times when somebody enters a building like this that's maybe not dressed the way we are. Maybe they're not of the same socioeconomic class that we are, and we kind of look down on them. And maybe we kind of inwardly judge them a little bit and think, whew, but they came from the wrong side of the tracks, if you know what I mean. No, actually, we all came from the wrong side of the tracks compared to God. And we need to keep that in mind. And as we're raising our children to not murder and not rape and not steal, not do all these big things, we also need to focus some time right here and make sure that they have a heart that's not filled with pride, not filled with things that are just as deadly. I meet a lot of parents who, they tell me all the wonderful things their kids have done. I had a true story. I had a lady one time, she was talking to me about her daughter had gone to medical school, married a physician or a lawyer, I forget which. She said they got a big old beach house right on Myrtle Beach. And she was telling me about how they'd gone to Ivy League schools, had really nice cars, all this stuff. And I said, Myrtle Beach? I've done a seminar in Myrtle Beach. Which congregation do they go to? Where do they attend? And that's when she got the look. Except this time, it was kind of most of you guys probably heard the deer in the headlight look. Or for those of you who are a little tech savvy, you know, when you reboot a computer and it just kind of goes blank for a little while. That's what she did. She just kind of, and then she paused and said, well, there is that one little problem, that they don't attend anywhere. And folks, let me tell you something. That's not a little problem. That is the problem. You know, I appreciate if your kids have gone and done a lot of great things, but if they miss the main thing, that's a pretty big deal. So, picture in your mind again, you're Jesus. He has just told these 3 parables in a row. The last one aimed at making sure the Pharisees realize, oh, we're the elder brother. What's the possible responses? Response number 1 is for them to realize and acknowledge that, oh man, ouch, that kind of hurts. I'm that elder brother. I'm the one who's not celebrating. Because, again, don't miss this point. Younger brother, he goes away. He's lost, right? He comes home. He repents. Do you realize the elder brother was just as lost, spiritually speaking, how far he was from his father? Second possible response from the Pharisees, or maybe from us. How dare you? How dare you point that out, harden your heart, and walk away? Now, which one do you think happened? Well, the one that happened actually is the answer to the question that I started with. You remember I said, before we end this morning, I want to talk about what happened between the elder brother and the father. If you take it literally, that the father is God, the elder brother is a Pharisee, or the father is Jesus and the elder brother is Pharisees, what did the elder brother end up doing to the father? Killed him. You see that? If Jesus is the one who is welcoming us, like that prodigal, and the Pharisees are the elder, do you realize they ended up killing him? That's the real ending of the story. And please do not miss the way in which they did it. They arrest him in an olive grove around midnight. Remember, he'd been in this room, upper room, observing Passover. The text says they sang some hymns together, and then he went to a place that he was familiar with. It's an important point, because that was kind of his happy place. You know, everybody in this room probably has a happy place. Maybe it's the beach or the mountains or your front porch. Jesus had a happy place, and it was the Garden of Gethsemane. And because of that, Judas knew where he was going to be. He could sell him out. They leave about 8 o'clock at night. They go down the steep valley, down the Kidron Valley, up the other side to this olive grove. He goes away to pray 3 times, an hour each time. You remember his sweat was, as it were, great drops of blood? Now that's interesting to me, because I know just a little bit later on in the night, there's going to be a guy named Peter who's warming himself by a fire, and yet Jesus is sweating. It's now close to midnight. An angry mob gathers together. They've got torches, they've got swords. They go down that same steep embankment. I have no doubt Jesus saw them. He could have walked away. But he knew now was his time. They come up. Judas betrays them. And let me again remind you, this is a disciple who saw all the miracles of Jesus Christ. Saw him walking on water. Saw him healing somebody blind. Lazarus, dead 4 days. He puts a heartbeat in it. Even with a kiss, he betrays the only sinless person that's ever walked this earth. Peter takes out his sword, cuts off the ear of Malchus. Jesus heals him. Malchus is servant of the high priest, which means he's going to have to kind of stand there the rest of the night as this sham of a trial is going on, thinking to himself, I don't know who this guy is, but I know I got my ear back. And that's when the physical insults really started. The text says they started hitting on him, spitting on him. So it's roughly midnight. They first carry him to Aeneas. Aeneas, the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the one who was responsible for the tables that Jesus had flipped a few days earlier, he was not a Jesus fan. He then goes to Caiaphas, the high priest. He's put on trial even though they had already determined his guilt. It was a sham of a trial. But the Jews couldn't kill somebody. They were under Roman authority. They had to wake up Pilate in the early morning hours. Pilate doesn't see anything wrong with this guy. In fact, he realizes he's a Galilean. He ships him off to Herod. Herod's in town. He's got a palace on the other side of Jerusalem. So this angry mob, they carry Jesus over there. Jesus didn't say a word. It infuriated Herod. He ships him back to Pilate. Again, Pilate doesn't see anything wrong with it. So he marches out his trump card, Barabbas. He stands him before the people and he says, all right, you know I have a tradition at the feast to release somebody. Who do you want? You want Jesus or this thug? Which, by the way, in the book of Acts, we learned that he really was a murderer. Do you want me to release somebody who you say jaywalked, or Ted Bundy to walk among your kids? And you know what the people said? Give us Ted Bundy. Give us Barabbas. What do you want me to do with Jesus? Crucify him. Crucify him. All of a sudden, the roars start going up. By the way, some of those who were yelling crucify him had just a few days earlier on Sunday been waving palm branches saying, Hosanna. John chapter 19, verse 1. Pilate had Jesus scourged. Scourging was a known preliminary for every Roman execution, because they knew that without that beating, strong men, they could remain on a cross for several days before they finally died from dehydration and exposure. And so what they would usually do is they would take a whip about 5 to 7 inches long, several leather straps coming off of it, tied off at various intervals. There would be pieces of sheep bone or metal. And to position a man for scourging, they would usually bind his wrists. They would tie him to an upright post. They would strip him down, and then they would beat that man unmercifully. Historical records tell us that on occasion, there were men who literally bit their tongue in two in anticipation of the pain that was coming from a scourging. And you can just imagine Jesus hearing that first crack of the whip. And then he hears it again, crack. And again, crack. And by now, blood is starting to wash down his back. And I need everybody in this room to understand, Jesus Christ, he didn't have to listen to it one time. He could have called 10,000 angels and been done with it. But he knew everybody in this room needed a spotless sacrifice. So he continued to listen to the crack of that whip until his back quite literally looked like shredded meat. They're not done. They decide to mock him. They put a crown of thorns on his head. The text says they continued to strike him. Put a royal robe on him. Put some reeds in his hands. They march him back in front of the Jews. Here's your king. Infuriating the Jews. And at some point, 4 Roman soldiers would step up. They would rip off that royal robe. A soldier would put about an 85 to 90 pound crossbeam on his shoulders. And they'd send him up a dusty road to Golgotha, the place of the skull. Latin, Calvary. Calvarium is what we call it in medicine. It's interesting to me, we sing a song, Burdens Are Lifted at Calvary. We're actually singing, Burdens Are Lifted at the place of the skull. And it would be there flanked by two thieves that Jesus would hang. He gets to the top of the hill. He's given the first of two drinks. That first one, I've learned through my research, was actually made by the women of the city. It was a compassion drink. They would mix myrrh or gall into it. And basically it served as kind of a mild painkiller for the next steps in the crucifixion. The nailing of the hands and the feet. And yet you remember Jesus having tasted it, he refused it. So I want you to picture an exhausted Christ, beaten, scourged, spit on. They throw him onto an old rugged cross on the ground. A Roman soldier comes up carrying iron spikes about 5 to 7 inches long. The reason I tell you that is twofold. Number one, because we've got archaeological evidence. Number two, so that you understand a single blow from a hammer would not have sufficiently anchored him home. So he had to lay there as they continue to pound those things in. If I had unlimited time, I could talk to you a little bit about the anatomy, where they put that spike, what it would feel like. But imagine the sun coming up. 4 Roman soldiers, they take that old rugged cross, they lift it upright, they drop it into a hole. And now he's got one major physiological problem left, and that is when they raise that cross upright, it puts the human body naturally, by gravity, in a Y-shaped position, making it very easy to inhale, but almost impossible to exhale. And so in order for him to get rid of the deadly gases that were building up in his lungs, he would actually have to put all of the weight of his body on that spike in his feet, temporarily pushing himself up to a T position. And he would do this over and over again. Slump back down, push himself up. That's why they broke their legs, by the way. And yet here's the amazing thing. I know Jesus Christ did it. Because he was on that cross for 6 hours. And we have many of the sayings that he made from the cross. Like when he looked down and he said, "Behold your mother." And the one that I can't fathom to this day, when he looked out and he said, "Father, forgive them. They know not what they do." Oh, you think these are the wrong people? Let me tell you something about the wrong people. The wrong people are who have sin and they don't even recognize it. At least these people acknowledged it. And they came home and they wanted to be with the master teacher. This morning, it is my hope and my prayer that as you think and meditate on these things, that you'll realize, you know what? Pride has no place in my life if I'm going to be close to Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. We're going to pause right there and get ready for worship. I appreciate very much your attention.